Hi, I'm Gian Balo from the GELITWO Z16 class. For transparency, there may be some clips where I have makeup on or I'm doing my makeup. This clip, I don't have my makeup on. I decided to film some sections at the same time and day while others not. Because I just wanted to get these parts done, but that's irrelevant. So anyways, I have claimed to love reading and literature since the moment I was conscious enough to choose what books to read. I would go to the bookstore and hide myself behind their shelves to read a book I hadn't bought yet from front to back. And I'd get away with it because, I was a kid and they couldn't do anything about it, and those books were unsealed anyway. And my parents would leave me in my own world where I would lay down on those dirty carpet floors of fully booked or power book while they did their shopping, and it would be my own personal heaven. But it was only recently when I realized I didn't know how to read. Or I don't know, that can have different meaning for anyone. Like, what does it mean to know how to read? But what I meant is, before, I'd limit myself to romance novels that, looking back, may not have much substance. I don't know. But as I went through my subjects under the literature department in DLSU, since senior high, including GLIT 2, I've come to know how to be a more critical evaluator of the media that I consume. I was introduced to works from the Philippines and around the world that made me not just focus on the subjective feelings that they would give me, but also understand every detail of it and how it can contribute to the work itself and its impact on wider society. First, for national in the global. This module introduced to us works that showed national traditions and the importance of diversity in shaping our world, and in this case, world literature. Some of the works we tackled here didn't explicitly mention a specific country's tradition, but we were taught to understand its context through its inspirations, hints in their settings and characters, and the authors themselves. And in doing so, we gain a wider perspective of our world that starts to unify with its diversity, because these works are more of a reflection of what we see in real life, even if, again, the works don't explicitly state that what their real life inspiration is. And we connect with one another by knowing our differences and opening ourselves to their culture, their pain, love, traditions, and more. I'll first tackle Bao and Hair Love, which are two short films we were told to watch under this module. For both of these stories, we explore the perspectives of communities we may not be totally part of. First in Bao, with the Asian diaspora and the struggle to find a connection within, the family-centered culture of Asia versus the more independent, westernized culture. And in Bao, we can see how the effects of globalization have changed our personal lives, such as family dynamics. Especially those of the Asian diaspora, they often talk about how difficult it is to connect with their parents who grew up with different values and have stuck to them. The parents also discuss how it's also hard for them to have a relationship with their children as they feel like they're so far away. And from that, I also understood the Filipino Americans back in the US. So again, it's a reflection of what we see in the real world. And in all honesty, there are times where I and many other Filipinos make fun of them because their idea of Filipino culture can be quite shallow. It's always it's always lumpia and adobo and tinikling and Vicks and jokoy. I don't like jokoy, I'm sorry. For us, it's overdone. But to them, it's their best way and their best attempt of connecting with a country that is so far away. And it's admirable that there are still some people who are at least making that effort to know their culture and their family's roots, even though, as we can see in Bao, it's such a struggle to do so, and it can almost feel like such a pressure to do so, as shown in the clip. Now, for Hair Love. For others, it may just be a simple, heartwarming story about a dad who struggles to do their daughter's hair while the mother is undergoing treatment in the hospital. But there's that deeper layer of why it's important that it was a black family portrayed here, with the hair itself fighting back against the dad. It's a message of how difficult it was to style their hair, but they learn and are able to do so anyway, because that's how they show their love. Similarly, to their history, in which they have always struggled under racism, slavery, and imperialism, but they still manage to keep their culture alive and fight back against those factors because that's how much they love themselves, their community, and their history. I think I'm counting Bao and Hair Love as one material since they're both short films. So my second material would be the Taximan story. Some of us have experienced taking a taxi or a Grab or whatever ride-hailing app there is today. And there would be drivers who would share their stories from their personal lives. So reading this work reminded me of those car rides. The taximan was talking about how hard he was working for the family, and then he goes on to talk about how he doesn't like the newer culture of the younger generation, which I totally get as a member of that younger generation. Many of us tend to be comfortable, talking back at our parents and not following rules. But come on, you guys don't do that. Anyways, back to the story itself, he then shares his frustration towards his daughter and his eventual punishment for her. And then abruptly, we are reminded that this is a car ride bound to end. It's almost as if that car ride was a world on its own, with two people stuck in an area and filling its space. And all of a sudden, we're reminded that this is all temporary and we have to go on with our lives, as if we didn't hear such an intimate, personal story about someone else's life. Now on to the lottery. We had a discussion in our class about the work that I found to be insightful, like all our lectures really. But one of the parts we discussed there was how the people in the village were following a tradition for so long. They don't even know why they're doing it, but the villagers continue to do so. And at this point, we outsiders only see this as an unnecessary act of violence, but for them, it's such an integral part of their identity as members of the village. Even if we can't trace the original necessity of it, for them, sticking with the status quo gives them at least that sense of stability. And I see that with the rise of political conservatism that tries so hard to defend traditional values that have been there for so long, because for them, it has worked for such a long time. Why give up that system now? It's such a radical change for them. And unlike the story, they have long justifications that I don't find justifiable, but for them, it's enough. Anyways, they have long reasons for why they keep their values, and even if it may be harmful for others. So even if the work itself doesn't really specify a real place, we can see reflections of it in our real world. And that's why when it was published, so many people were mad at the author because it was a pointless, brutal tradition and they were shocked by the inhumanity of it. But they, or we, also feel how it can also show how we are in our attempts to preserve the status quo, wherein we don't realize that we have hurt others. For our second module, Colonial Past and Post-Colonial Present, I have to say that this was my favorite module as someone interested in colonial and post-colonial studies since my senior high years. I mentioned this in my Module 2 essay exam, but I feel the need to say it again because it explains my interest. I'm currently majoring in international studies and majoring in European studies. In my program, it constantly emphasizes to us how countries, especially those from the West, dominate much of the organizations, institutions, systems, and narratives in the international arena, as we call it. With this, I gained a feeling of loss and yearning for a study regarding what they would consider weaker countries, especially those that were ravaged by the effects of colonialism, like us. And as this course introduced me to post-colonial literary theory, I am reminded of how art and literature can be political and how these two can be used to emancipate or strengthen the identity of countries like ours that still feel the effects of colonialism. I wanted to start out with the micro aspects of colonialism with "you've got to be carefully taught." It tells us how discriminatory ideas are taught to us. It isn't something that we are born with. While, yes, it may be natural for us to stay in groups or communities where there are people who are more similar to us, this is different from judging those outside of the communities and assuming that they have different characteristics and personalities that we should be disgusted by or we can make fun of. I was taught at a young age, for example, I should be scared of dark-skinned people because they're more likely to be poor, meaning they can hurt me to get something that they want from me, a light-skinned, privileged person. Which is obviously wrong and harmful. And on the other hand, I also mentioned this in my essay, I wasn't taught until my high school years about like the whole labels on gender and attraction and how they were a thing. I thought it was fine liking girls. I thought it was normal. There was no concept of bisexuality yet or homosexuality to me. But it was in my Christian living class in grade 8 that taught me that homosexuality is a sin. I wanted to mention what class it was that told me this because I didn't realize it before, but colonialism brought these ideas to us. Spanish colonization brought us Catholicism and taught our ancestors and Filipinos to this day that homosexuality is a sin. Spanish colonization taught us that fairer skin would mean that you had foreign blood or didn't get out much to work, so that meant you were rich. And of course, who wouldn't want to be in that position where we felt comfortable with our lives, right? So we perpetuate this system. We teach it to our children, and for us, they may be simple opinions or even something that we believe are facts. But on a wider scale, this is one of the many things that colonizers brought to us in order to keep themselves in power. And so here, we're taught that even the smallest actions are political. Next is the video on post-colonial literary theory. Like I also said in my essay, I was really fascinated when they brought up language as a tool to emancipate. The language that you use is already a message itself, as it decides who our target audience is when we write. If we have the goal of freeing ourselves from our colonial past, what's the best way to do so? Writing in English so that more people around the world would know our struggles, or in our native language where we would want our message to reach members of our nation first who may be more comfortable and knowledgeable on this rather than English, which is said to be a colonizer's language that continues to oppress us by being inaccessible, what's the word? By our own people. Inaccessible, okay. Like I said in my essay, it's ironic that I'm literally speaking in English right now, even though I do agree on the latter opinion of encouraging the usage of our own native or local languages. Based on my experience as someone who's been spokening dollar, as people would call me, I did feel out of place in my own community because I couldn't understand their jokes, their culture, their problems. Then when I went to the humanities and social sciences strand, I understood how we really need to know the language that our community was using. And that's why I feel a bit more comfortable actually in speaking in Tagalog and Filipino in conversations nowadays. How could we be in the service of the Filipinos and our country if we didn't understand each other? So again, bringing up the point that this is exactly what our colonizers wanted. They wanted to keep us fractured so that we wouldn't be able to unite and fight against them together. And now lastly, for the telephone conversation. It was a straightforward read about an African man talking to a white lady over the phone. And in the copy that we were given, the words of the landlady were stylized to be in all capital letters, which further pushed the power dynamic the two had and the dominance that she was showing over him. I think it's great that we are shown works from Africans and African Americans regarding racism and post-colonialism, because from what I could see, there's much focus on them being one of the leading voices in post-colonial works as a people who come from a continent that was notoriously ravaged by imperialism. And I really do admire how they keep their culture strong despite centuries of attempts to wipe them out and keep them subservient. And as a Filipino, I actually feel disappointed that it's not exactly the same for us. I do see in my generation that post-colonial studies and going back to our pre-colonial roots is apparently a trend, according to one of my other professors. But there's still that majority of people who are not interested in this. In our Araling Panlipunan or Hekasi subjects, we aren't taught to have strong negative feelings towards our colonizers, especially the American colonizers. And in fact, I've noticed that we're taught to almost be grateful that they came into the picture and brought us English. So unlike the Africans and African Americans, we aren't exactly fighting back against this culture that would encourage us to keep seeing our colonizers as superior. And from that, I really do believe that it will take so much time for us to learn how to love ourselves and defend ourselves whenever we are told that Filipinos are, insert negative stereotype here, instead of this status quo of being complacent or even encouraging of it. I hope my voice is clear because the aircon's quite loud here and the LRT is also just right there. Anyways, but I'll try my best. Our third module, Body and Mind and Desire, felt more personal as it explored the deep depths of our soul. It would sometimes feel invasive, even if it wasn't pointing at me saying, hey, these are for Gian Balo specifically, but it touched on aspects of my womanhood with the vagina monologues, my insecurities with Dear Evan Hansen, and just the concept of memory with In a Bamboo Grove. It encouraged me to look within myself and find inspiration in my own life to really tap into the complexity of humanity. And it feels weird how uncomfortable we may be consuming such topics, but it's also these works that make us feel like we're not alone in having these thoughts. So with the vagina monologues, I was forced to explore more of my anatomy. I identify more as gender fluid. Sometimes I see myself as a woman, sometimes as a man. Sometimes it doesn't matter because what is being a woman and what is being a man. But with gender being a social construct and with me presenting myself as more feminine in public, I still feel like a female because that's how people treat me. I say female because I want to focus on my anatomy as someone with a female reproductive system and looks quote-unquote like a typical female, whatever that means. I have a complicated relationship with my private parts. And most of the time, it's not a big deal. It's just a part of my body. But in discussions about the vagina being such an integral part for some feminists as proof that you're a woman, I feel quite conflicted about it. And I honestly don't know how to start my discussion on this. I connect so much more with it because I have been treated in similar ways due to what I have down here and how to present and how I present myself. But then there are times where I wish I didn't connect with it and that I wanted to present myself in a different way. But with that, there comes the discussion of my transness and how some TERFs would say that I'm betraying women for not wanting to struggle like them and for wanting to be the more privileged gender. It's all so complicated and I'm sorry this sounds messy, but this is what my mind looked like as I was reading works like Hair or Reclaiming Cunt that was more about our anatomy, or the other stories that tackle the struggles of being a woman like My Vagina Was My Village. In Dear Evan Hansen, I also mentioned this in our last module essay, but I did not want to read this work because the premise was quite weird to me. You take advantage of someone's suicide in order to give yourself a better image. And I thought, by the way, the songs were kind of corny. But I understand sort of where Evan was coming from as someone who used to be like him. I used to be less of an outcast but more of a loner because I wanted to be alone. But there were times where I felt like I needed to give myself a different image in order to survive because I didn't want to have a future where I'd regret not making enough connections so I'd know who to talk to when I needed help. I also wrote to myself a lot like Evan did. So seeing how I was back then through another character, the motorcycle, was what made me understand the work overall, going back to my point that these taboo topics being discussed openly is sometimes the thing that gives us a feeling of connection. Now for In a Grove. It seems like a simple, entertaining story about people giving different sides, and that's why it's so amusing because you don't really know who's telling the truth. Until I asked myself, why is their story told the way that it is? What were the thoughts, insecurities, desires of the people interviewed for them to interpret the scene the way that they did? And it made me analyze my own points of view on problems I've had that involved other people who had a different perspective from mine. Like, I'd wonder, where is my opinion coming from for me to get to this conclusion and to feel like this? What do they want from the situation for them to see it in another view? And I think this would go on to my future points of the elements of literary experience where the situation could be the work, and we are the readers who have their own biases that then affect our interpretation of it. Like, we'd ask ourselves, why did the samurai think of the wife that way? Why did the wife say that she still loved the husband and he looked at her in a certain way? Like, where is that experience and where is that possible bias coming from? So that was a really interesting point in the work for me, because it would really go deep into the mind of the person and make us examine where those opinions might be coming from. Now to discuss my reflections on the module materials. First with Hero's Journey. I had a lot of fun learning about the hero's journey. I've heard of it before in other videos that I've watched, but I didn't really use it to analyze media that I would consume. And truth be told, while you, Sir Oscar, were discussing this in class, I just watched Dune 1 and 2 the day before, and I was already excited to possibly use the hero's journey to talk about Dune again, or other shows and movies and books that I love. But what I learned after I was done obsessing over my favorite media was that it was a helpful tool for writers to know where their story was going. As the audience, I would want to have a clear understanding of the progress also that the main character would have. And there would be some shows in the past where I felt like I wasn't going to get that satisfying ending. I didn't say happy ending. I'm okay with them having tragic development like Paul Atreides from Dune. It's still the hero's journey somehow. But when I say satisfying, I mean that I can clearly see how they grew throughout their journey and what lessons they got, what their character arc was, and did it possibly get lost as seasons came and went, because some shows are like that, like lost the plot and stuff. I also enjoy watching that first episode, by the way, of Son of Zorn, and I was disappointed to find out that it was discontinued after one season on a cliffhanger. Point is, I'm glad that we got to dissect its first episode through Hero's Journey, because from that episode alone, I understood Zorn's purpose, the journey he was going to face throughout the season, and I realized what a good pilot should be like, because it was already telling us what we should expect from the show and from Zorn if it didn't discontinue. Now on to the elements of fiction. This is just a review of things that we were taught in our other literature or English classes, but it was helpful to look back on them so that we could remind ourselves how to analyze what we are reading or watching as critical consumers of media. Sometimes I could feel a sense of satisfaction or dissatisfaction with what I would just watch, but I wouldn't get why until I recognized these elements like devices used by the author, how a character was portrayed, and I would review them bit by bit. Why was I so satisfied, for example, with Avatar: The Last Airbender? What made me appreciate Zuko's redemption arc as much as any other person who watched that show? Like, let's be real. What's with their portrayal of imperialism, genocide, for a kid's show that made anyone of any age just know what they're talking about? And it helps me enjoy, or at least understand, what I'm watching, and that just makes it an even more satisfying experience. Lastly, we're going back to our first lesson, which was the elements of literary experience. Again, just like the elements of fiction, it's something that we need to learn in order to analyze our media and works better. We don't just read a text for what it is. So because of this lesson, I also do my research on the authors of the book I read, what was the context of them writing it, or what were the other works that existed when that book came around. So for example, Kim Ji-young, born 1982, is a popular book in South Korea that is credited to have propelled the feminist movement there. And I found out that the author, Cho Namju, wrote the book because the life of the main character isn't really that different from her own life. And just that fact alone gave me a much deeper understanding, especially as a woman myself, of how important it is that a work like this would exist. So from that alone, I got to enjoy the text more by connecting it with the author and with the reader, who is myself, ang lumikha at ang kalikha. Short comment, it was also really cool to say the to see the Tagalog or Filipino versions of the elements of literary experience, because seeing everything go around the word likha was not only interesting as someone who loves linguistics, but I'd also say that it made me better see the relationship all these aspects had with one another. This then brings me to how it would contribute to my development as a member of society. By teaching us to understand media, we are also taught how to dig deeper into the socio-political climate that we have. When I tell myself that something is not that deep, I deprive first myself from getting to see all sides of the story, but then I also deprive other people of the ways that I could have helped them if I just stuck around and listened. If I get stressed over politics, as I always am since it's my course, I don't just say, well, ganyan talaga yung buhay, that's just life, and end it with that. When I have enough energy, I talk to other people about it. Why should we be complacent and accept things on the surface level? It's important to understand the history of our institutions and our systems, the people involved in it, our leaders' reasons for making their decisions that we complain about or support. Not only that, but in the introduction to national, global, and personal works, this way we have become more open to different perspectives and aspects of society that would give us even more insights to solve on how to solve or address a certain issue. Now, to conclude with all that I said, I did have a fun time in GELITWO. Was it difficult? Yes, and even you, Sir Oscar, did warn us that we did have to work hard to get that 4. But I'm not the kind of person that likes the easy 4 kind of classes. Not most of the time. I mean, I'd love that grade, but I'd really prefer it if I had to work hard, because it would always, for me, give a more satisfying result. With the hard work comes better product. It makes our tuition worth it because it makes us learn and prepare us to be responsible individuals and citizens who won't be easily swayed by surface level ideas or just drop something because it's difficult to understand. It's corny to say this, but it really does make the journey worthwhile, just like how we've understood our own hero's journey and how we saw GELITWO as the adventure that we had to go. By the end of it all, I feel like a changed person because I genuinely did enjoy the classes and all the things that we had to do for this subject.